700 Club. U.S. allies have turned against America and Israel at the United Nations, and that was just yesterday. Some are saying it's just another example of the UN's anti-Israel bias.
Well, the vote was meant to shame President Trump for recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, United States leaders are reevaluating who their friends really are. Jennifer Wishon explains.
Fireworks at the United Nations, member countries accusing the U.S. of bullying. The U.S. taking names of countries that vote to denounce President Trump's decision on Jerusalem, while readily taking millions in aid money from U.S. taxpayers.
This is bullying.
Turkey, America's NATO ally, sponsored the resolution. President Trump threatened to withhold funding to nations that voted against the U.S.
We will not be intimidated. You can be strong, but this doesn't make you right.
The vote, 128 to 9, with 56 countries either abstaining or absent. After Israel, top recipients of U.S. aid are Muslim, African, and Arab countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and they voted against the U.S. Next year, America is scheduled to hand out nearly $26 billion in foreign aid.
We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. And we will remember it when so many countries come calling on us, as they so often do, to pay even more and to use our influence for their benefit.
Among the countries abstaining, Canada, Mexico, and Australia. Key European allies, Britain, France, and Germany, all voted for the resolution. Israel's ambassador called out the hypocrisy of the General Assembly, which disproportionately focuses on the Jewish state.
The PA threatened violence and days of rage, but the UN had no condemnation.
Dannon says the resolution only emboldens Palestinians to reject peace.
You are puppets pulled by the strings of your Palestinian puppet masters. You are like marionettes forced to dance while the Palestinian leadership looks on with glee.
Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to move forward with plans to move its embassy to Jerusalem. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Well, for more on this, with us now from Jacksonville, Florida, is Congressman Ron DeSantis. He's the chairman of the National Security Subcommittee. He's also a leader in Congress on supporting Israel and moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And Congressman DeSantis, welcome back to the 700 Club.
Good morning.
Let's talk about this UN vote. I think a lot of people aren't getting just how much hypocrisy is here because Russia voted against the United States, voted against moving our embassy to Jerusalem. And just this year, back in April, Russia recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Why aren't people seizing on that and saying this is an obvious double standard?
Because this is just what the UN does. In 2016, they did 24 resolutions. And you think about it, there's way more than 24 problems throughout the world. So what were those resolutions about? Maybe war, peace, death, disease? No. 20 of the 24 resolutions were attacking Israel. So this body has basically become a hotbed of anti-Israel fervor. It's pathological. And so I think even a country like Russia they did do this before we did. Nevertheless, in the venue of the UN, I think these countries can't help themselves. And this is just what they do. But it shows why the UN has really outlived its usefulness.
Should we be looking at that? Should we be looking at, should we defund the UN? Is that the solution here?
Well, you remember last December when the Obama administration pushed through UN Resolution 2334, which basically was one of the strongest anti-Israel resolutions. It said that the Western Wall and places in the old city of Jerusalem were occupied Arab territory, even though those are the most historic Jewish sites in the world. That, I think, should have been responded to by the Congress cutting off funds. We chose not to do that. I think that was a mistake. But I think now with President Trump in office, he set a clear signal saying, look, we give you guys all this money, you're going to come in and vote against the United States. We're going to reevaluate how we're doling out the funds. And I think the UN, in that big, cumbersome, ineffective bureaucracy, should probably be the first target as we look to use the power of the purse to advance our foreign policy goals.
We launched an online petition to get Congress to support the Taylor Force Act. And in that process, we discovered most Americans don't know that the U.S. is actually funding the Palestinian Authority. Is that another target that we need to take up?
Without question, the House passed Taylor Force. It's a good bill. It got watered down a little bit. It's still better than nothing, but I wish it was even stronger. The Senate needs to take that up when they get back in January. I think they probably can pass it, but if they're senators who are going to vote against that, you got to make them go on record so the American people know the positions that they're taking. But the idea that we would send money to the Palestinian Authority when they're paying salaries and pensions to the families of terrorists who murder Israeli Jews and Americans, the American people will say, why on earth are we doing that? And the problem is that when we keep doing policies like that, it really keeps the Palestinians in this vicious cycle of hatred towards Israel and the Jewish people. If you look at their schools, they incite a lot of hatred and teach young people to hate Israel. The maps that they use in their schools do not even list Israel on the maps. Some of these terrorists who commit acts of terrorism, they get streets named after them and sports stadiums named after them. So that's the culture that we're dealing with. And if you subsidize that culture with American tax dollars, it seems to me you're going to get more bad behavior.
Well, there's another subsidy going on, and that is the United Nations Relief Works Agency, Unruh. Back in 2003, the GAO found that there were 3 paid staff members who were convicted of terrorist acts, and U.S. money is funding Unruh. We're one of the largest funders of that. Is the House going to conduct yet another review of U.S. support for Unruh?
Look, this is something I've been pushing for several years now. And you're exactly right on the facts. And I would say, if you remember, when the Hamas was launching the rocket attacks against Israel back in 2014, a lot of those rocket attacks were emanating from Unruh schools. And so you go and ask them, what's the deal with this? Oh, we didn't know there were rockets in the schools, all this other stuff. It really stinks. We haven't been successful about doing that, but I think we need to. And I think with President Trump, he's somebody, if he sees the facts on this, he's going to say, well, of course we need to take action. But all the way through, for years and years, funding for things like Unruh has been things that the D.C. foreign policy establishment has always advocated for, and they've not wanted to indulge in any critical thinking on this. I think the taxpayers are going to demand that, and we absolutely should reevaluate it.
Well, I think you're dead on the D.C. foreign policy establishment. And it's not just on Unruh, it's the entire attitude of the foreign policy establishment toward Israel. President Truman actually had to go against his State Department in order to recognize Israel back in 1948. And I assume President Trump had to go against his State Department in order to move the embassy. So that hasn't changed. And curiously, they also seem to ignore Congress on this. The law's been on the books since 1961 that U.S. foreign aid should never support the PLO, anyone being trained for terrorism, any terrorist organization. But it seems routinely for that law to be ignored. How can we really get some teeth in this? Because the will of the American people is clear. Our tax dollars should not be funding terrorism. And at the same time, it seems to be going on, and our State Department, our Foreign Service, seems to be turning a blind eye to it.
Yeah, look, I think you just need to, I just think you need to defund it. And if the behavior changes, then you can reevaluate. But what happens is there will be statements like that in the law, but then there'll be these caveats. And what the State Department will do, they'll always view the prohibition very narrowly and the caveat very expansively. And you're exactly right. They're a big problem when it comes to all these issues related to Israel. When I went to Israel in March to look at sites for where we could move the American embassy to Jerusalem, the State Department folks that were briefing me on the ground were predicting Armageddon if we were to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move the embassy. They said it was the worst thing that could be done. And that just hasn't borne out. I mean, they've been wrong about a lot of these things. And so I think they've been wrong about the foreign aid and about the aid to the Palestinians. But you got to write the law so that you don't give the bureaucrats the wiggle room that they use to exploit this.
Well, on moving the embassy, there is currently 2 U.S. consulate buildings in Jerusalem. One of them is absolutely huge. It's an enormous structure. If you want to move the embassy, just take a floor in that consulate and you've accomplished it. And you don't have to spend any more money. You don't have to develop a site. It's already there.
And that's what's going to happen is the president made the announcement. It was courageous. It was the right thing to do. Whether he's going to have support from the bureaucracy to implement the vision of his speech remains to be seen. The State Department has said, oh, it's going to take, 3, 4, maybe 8 years to establish an embassy in Jerusalem. And what you said is exactly right. I've visited both of those consulates. You can do it immediately, but the idea that we're going to wait for potentially a new president to come in before we do it, that's unacceptable. To me, that's an example of the bureaucracy trying to run out the clock so that they don't have to follow through. So what I'll be doing on my subcommittee is I will definitely be bringing in the State Department. We're going to hold their feet to the fire to make sure that we're taking steps so that our ambassador is in Jerusalem and we're conducting business there. You can do it. If you look at that Arnona annex, the consulate annex, there's a hotel right next to it that the U.S. owns. You could have a massive complex there. It would be really good. It'd be safe. And that could be done in relatively short order. It's not going to take 3 or 4 years to do that.
Wonderful news. That is Congressman DeSantis. Thank you. Thank you for being strong on Israel, and Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas and God bless.
Well, if you want to be involved in this, this certainly gets my blood boiling when you see obvious hypocrisy, obvious concealment of facts. It's been going on now for 70 years, and it's both within our foreign policy establishment, it's at the UN, and who's picking up the tab for it? You and I, American taxpayers. We're paying for the Palestinian Authority. We're paying for this relief, if you want to call it that, relief going to support terror networks. And it's all designed to kick the can down the road until the Palestinians somehow come to a peace table. What it's really doing is funding their anti-Israel rhetoric and their stance. And if you're being paid to be a refugee, well, you're going to continue to be a refugee. Well, I've got some great news for you. We've had 23,000 people sign a petition. And I've got it in my hands right here. These are the number of people who have signed a petition to support the Taylor Force Act. That's being delivered to the U.S. Senate today. I encourage you to call your senator at the start of the year. We're going to tell you more about it as to when they're going to pick this act up. This is going to stop the funding of terrorists. That's what's happening right now with our tax dollars. If someone commits a terrorist act from the Palestinian Authority, they or their family gets a monthly stipend for life. And it's our tax dollars paying for it. And we need to stop it and put some teeth into it to say, no more, no, not on our dollar. If you want to kill Israelis, you're not going to do it with our money. So we're delivering this petition to the Senate today. We're going to tell you more about how you can get involved, but we need to stop this nonsense. We need to do it today.